Welcome to Smart Branding, a podcast dedicated to branding, naming, and domain names. I'm Tatiana Bonneau, and with my guests, we try to help you create and grow strong, memorable, and meaningful brands online. I believe time is one of our most precious assets, and so I want to thank you in advance if you decide to spend the next 30 minutes with us. I promise to do my best to make those worth it. Let's go! So today my guest is Mark Gunnion. He's been already on Smart Branding, but in a written form. So I'm really excited to have him here. He's also known as the naming guy. So we have a lot to talk about. Thank you for making the time for a second time now in audio. Mark, it's wonderful to have you with us.
Great to be here, Tatiana. Thanks for asking.
So let's start with my classic first question. Give us a little bit of a background. Who are you? What do you do? How did you get into naming?
Sure. I'm Mark Gunnion, and that's Gunnion. You can find my webpage at gunnion.com. And I am a namer. I am a full-time, flat-out professional namer. I've been doing it for 27 years now. Wow. And what I do is I deal with clients and agencies around the world who need a new name for their product or company or service or website or whatever. And what I do is I work with the branding people at those companies. Basically, they hire me on a per project basis. And I create big lists, long lists of name ideas based on their briefs. They pick their favorites, and then I do a pretty solid 3-stage screening for availability on their favorites. It's not a legal screen because I'm not a lawyer, but I can save them a lot of legal fees by checking out publicly accessible resources. Sometimes they want me to chime in and give my opinion too, and I can do that. But I am very focused in my job in doing the creative part of name creation. And I see you were or still are a screenwriter. That's true. Well, we have to call that a hobby at this point because I've only made a couple grand doing that. I have not yet broken through as a screenwriter, but I have been writing feature screenplays since 2015, and I just finished my 9th. So I'm still swinging on that one, but we have to call that a hobby when we talk to the IRS at this point because I have. No, I did think that there is kind of a relation, you have to be good with words if you're into naming. So, and not just that, but in the current world of screenwriting and just screenwriting as a discipline in general, it's like naming and like poetry in that it's all about compression. It's all about how much meaning can you fit in how small of a space, because the pressures on screenwriting are terrible as far as like how much time you get to put it across and how much attention of the reader you get. So it's a similar skill actually. I like the way you put it, in that you like have to take as much meaning as you can, put it in as small of a space, if you like, figuratively, well, and literally speaking, if we're talking about names. Yeah. Well, before I began naming, my main credit was I was a lyricist. I was a songwriter and a lyricist. And that's a similar kind of thing where you try to make, you try to tell a whole chapter of a story in just one line all the time. And so when I first started naming, when I was looking for work and I would send out cold emails to agencies looking for work, I would always tout my experience as a lyricist as a qualification, since I hadn't named anything yet. I had named all my bands and stuff like that. I had no experience. How did that come across? Because even today, I think, naming expert namer, it's getting a bit more popular, I would say, but at least in my experience, and before I got into domain names and branding, I was in marketing and IT, and it's always been like in the majority of cases, people
feel like that's something that either is not important enough to hire somebody, or they feel like, of course, I can come up with a name, it's my company or my product.
I named my kid, I named my pet. How hard can it be?
There you go. Yeah.
Well, I was lucky because it was 1996 and I was in San Francisco, and the tech boom was just building and just starting to roll out of Northern California, just south of San Francisco. And so San Francisco, with all of its ad agencies and everything, was one of the first global hotspots really for the naming business. So I was at home in my it was at that time, it was my listening room. I had all my albums and I was just down there listening to the radio, and I'm listening to NPR, and I heard an interview with a woman on the radio, and it was one of these radio shows about, cool new jobs, or exciting, weird jobs. And she was a namer. She described herself as a namer and talked about the job a little bit. And I knew instantly, oh, I could do that job. I could definitely do that job. And it was a wonderful woman. Her name's Andrea Michaels. She's still a namer. And she was in the phone book. I called her up, and she was just fantastically generous with me and gave me all kinds of advice about the agencies that she worked for and how she got started. And so the next day, I put together a jazzy little cold email, and I started emailing the agencies. And at that time, there were half a dozen companies, branding agencies, but a couple of them were actually straight up naming companies in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, that I could write to directly. And within a week, I had jobs. And at the time when I was a songwriter, I was a performing musician too in bands. And the first job I got naming something, the paycheck was twice as much as I'd ever made from any gig ever. And I was like, that's the business for me. And so I got right into it, and I've been doing it ever since.
Very cool. How does it work? So I'm kind of trying to draw a parallel in, for example, with domain names. Usually when people get to talk to me, it's after they've got it wrong already. Like they've, didn't think it's important, so they can do it themselves, didn't want to spend money, whatever the reason, it went wrong. And after that, they come and try to fix it. How does it work with naming? And if we were to expand that a little bit as a form of advice to people, like when is the right time to look into somebody like you?
Yeah, it's as you probably know, the people are more sophisticated these days than they were in 1996 about it, but especially early on, the job of a namer and a domain namer, as you know, kind of happened because there was an artificial choke point in the tech economy that was created when they decided that the web would be driven by domain names. And so once they decided that the way you would find a web page is by using, the 26 characters of the English language, essentially, that created an artificial narrowing of usage of words and names to describe a company, right? So suddenly there was a premium on those, and there was competition for them. It used to be if you named your new, your new widget that you were only going to sell in your county, you would dream up a name and use it. But since the 90s now, first thing they would do is go online and Google it and look. And so, and then you would find out that, it was in use 5 places around the world. There was a tea house here, and it was a car there, and it was, a men's club in Budapest or something. So those forces created the job. And so people, entrepreneurs and founders have learned now in time that there is that it is high stakes, and they have learned that it's something they have to think about. But still, to this day, people don't realize how scarce and how much competition there is around the idea of a name. And so, I mean, so often, especially with something techy or with engineers, they've had an in-house name that they've used during the whole development process. And then they get right up to where they're going to debut it, and they start filling out the legal forms, and some lawyer says, "Are you sure you can have that?" Or somebody finally cheap enough. And they find out, even though they've announced their debut date, they suddenly realize they need a name that's available. So as you probably know too, the time pressure is a very regular thing for people in our job, that people are definitely in a hurry. And in fact, many things are waiting for the right name, like you can't invest in a trademark, you can't incorporate until you have a name. And so it's not uncommon at all for people to be in a huge rush by the time they get to you and me. So I find that a lot of times that people have, now of course people are more sophisticated about it now and more experienced. Plus people, I think, start Googling their name idea a lot earlier, finding out, and then they start pulling their hair out because as you know, practically every English word, these days almost every Latin word and Italian or Japanese is owned by somebody. Now, it may not be in use, and we have found now, especially with the maturing of the business, that a huge percentage of those names are taken, but they're not in use. They're owned by somebody, and there's people like you who may have a bunch on the shelf that they are, hoping to sell. There's also people who just casually have picked up names in the course of their business and own them, but aren't using them. And so there's now a huge gray area of what's available and what's not. And so people need some expert consultation a lot of times about how to get a name, what is really available, and what is on the table for them to pick up.
Absolutely, and I do, as you said, that a lot of I guess every company, every team, as soon as you start working on something, you have to call it something. And it's funny because it kind of, I had a flashback on the time when I used to have an IT company and we would work like on software or different projects, and you'd have people coming up with ideas and like, I'm going to do this and it's going to do that and it's going to do this. And, we're talking about like functionality, and everything changes as soon as you give it a name. Like it's almost like the team is not a team until it has a name. Like you have people talking and everybody pulling in their direction. There's no personality to there's no vision to that idea. And I think that's one of the reasons why I got into domaining as brand assets, and also, as part of that, of that process.
It happens all the time that figuring out the name for a product, especially a tech product, is the first time that the different engineers and the different administrators all have to take a step all the way back until they can see the whole thing, and imagine that product out in the marketplace. A software engineer so often is so focused on the one piece of wood in front of them they've got to chop. They've worked on that for 10 months and are such a specialist. And then figuring out the name of your company makes the executives and the engineers and everybody really look at their product, maybe for the first time, as holistically and as remotely as possible. That is, they have to really consider the whole thing and where it's going to fit into the culture and fit into the market. And so it's interesting sometimes just to bring those people around and say, oh, well, what countries are you going to be working in, and
absolutely,
it really oftentimes make people think about their whole product for the first time.
Absolutely. And let's talk about that. What are the considerations that you have when choosing a name. And I'm sure that a lot of times, as you just said, what are the countries that people oftentimes think of, that's my product, and they don't think ahead or much ahead. Sometimes it's just because they're so excited about it and that they don't have that vision about how it can evolve in the future. Sometimes it's because they just don't want to dare to think that might be global one day, that might be there in 15 years. But what are the considerations that you take into account when coming up with a name?
Well, there's lots of considerations, of course, and the size of your market or your potential market is always a big one, of course, when we're talking about language. Sometimes, when you're thinking that you're just going to be an American product and you don't anticipate it crossing over even into other English-speaking countries, if it's going to be Australian or British or something like that, where you'll find a market, which is easier. But if you plan from the beginning to be a global market, to be a global product, or at least to have that potential, or if you're an importer-exporter type, a country that even if your main market is in an English-speaking world, your suppliers may be from other countries and so on. And so the name has to work in that avenue as well. Something I always tell people is that the name doesn't have to do everything, but it has to do a few jobs really well. A lot of times people think that their name needs to carry their entire value proposition, or it has to be like their quarterly report, or it has to be an entire elevator pitch or something packed into the name. But that's not what a name really has to do. A name has to do a few things. It has to work in communication. When you say it on the phone, does the person you're talking to know exactly what you said? Can they write it down and spell it right the first time? It has to differentiate you from your competition. That is, it can't sound like just another app where you drop a letter out of the ER or something like that. And it's in a way, and so those are the essentials. And then then there's the magic part. Then there's the emotional part. It has to have some component that works for the founders or the people working at the company on an aesthetic level. It has to be in a way. I tell CEOs that the new name of your company is going to be like a big abstract painting that sits across from your desk. You're going to see it and look at it and see it every day. It is going to be in your face. There's nothing else you will spend money on that you will use as often as the name. Not even the front door of your shop used as many times a day as the name. It's going to be on your business card and your T-shirts and in your email address and your commercials. It's just going to be everywhere. So you have to love it a little bit. And so there are technical considerations. Of course, if we're selling, if a big market for a product is going to be in China, there are certain letters you don't want to include in it because the language doesn't use those letters very often. If it's a name that depends on some visual pun, that may not work as well if it's a product that's only going to be, that is only spread by word of mouth, or promoted that way. So the marketplaces that you're going into is important and will have technical implications for the name itself. And then there's universal things that everybody wants. It's got to be easy to say and easy to spell. It's got to be memorable. And of course, there are always pressures to make a name short. It's very rare for somebody to come and say, I need a really long name for this, So there's always that pressure. And as you know, in the domain world, a 4-letter domain is inherently more valuable than a 10-letter domain in almost every case, right? So those are some of the technical considerations, but that emotional aesthetic element can't be underrated either, because that is such a big experience of a name, is how it feels in your head.
Absolutely. And it goes with the whole like story, and so everything you're gonna build around it for, you know, the lifetime of that brand.
Yeah. When you build up a logo, when you add a tagline, you know, a whole construction, a whole apparatus gets attached to a name. And if it's a name that means one thing in English to most of your clientele, but is like some, you know, shocking profanity in German or Russian or something, then, well, depending on where you are now, that can, there's a cost, you know, there's and that's, there are specialists, of course, you know well, I'm sure, there are specialists in checking the implications of a given name in other languages. And, but sometimes sometimes even that can be hard to communicate. I remember I worked at an agency once, and there was a name they were considering, and they were running the short list by a person from a very devout religious country, where the entire country had a kind of a religious base. And this person was afraid to tell us the meanings of some of the words, like the slang meanings and the street meanings. Okay. They thought we'd be offended by them even discussing it, you know. So you need somebody who's going to tell you the truth and who's going to be direct when you're working with language, because, you know, our intention is not to shock or anything like that. But it's hard to know the down all the way out in the world how your name is going to,
especially now, with the internet. There's so, like, everything goes so fast and information is so accessible and travels so quick. It makes that really hard to anticipate all the possible ways, you know, something can go. Not to mention that in time, you know, language changes. So
right.
Things that
And not just information is accessible, but disinformation is accessible too. I have some clients who want to run all their finalists like by the Urban Dictionary online. Well, the Urban Dictionary is not an authoritative thing. It's, you know, individuals post things to Urban Dictionary, so they can just be making fun of their little brother or something and saying, you know, oh, Billy, that means toilet, ah ha ha, and then, you know, and looks at them and says, oh, it means toilet. So sometimes you have to weed out the data from the disinformation too, and that's you know, sometimes it's worth the fight, and sometimes you just have to let them go. Sometimes.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case. Let's talk about domain names a little bit. So you just said you have Gunnion.com. I saw you have MarkGunnionNames.com. You have Mark Gunnion as well. What are your thoughts on domains? And I'm really curious because I ask everybody, but like, you've been in naming since 1996. I don't even know where I was in 1996. So you've been like in that whole, you know, space for so long. So you've seen from, you know, before, I guess, domain names were that important, and through different, you know, ups and downs. And I kind of learned that history backwards. Obviously, I've been, you know, using the internet and domain names and all that, but more of in a way that I wasn't involved in that. So I would, you know, like, I've been hearing things, you know, I don't know, search engines are going to kill domain names, and social networks are going to kill domain names. And then with, you know, 35 years of internet later, they still matter. And I'm sure you're aware, like, domain names like that selling literally, you know, for hundreds and thousands and millions, like all the time. So in terms of, where you stand, your thoughts and your considerations on where do you see domain names today?
Well, this is something where your incentives and mine might diverge a little bit, because early on, as a namer, I hated domain names. I hated people who warehoused the names and had them, right? Because I was thinking, I can't get that because somebody's sitting on it. But I came to understand that domainers play a really important role now in the business because you create a market, and the market eventually will settle on a reality. And so now I'm glad that there are so many domainers out there, because, the price of a domain name has kind of reached a level. There is of course, a single word can still go for literally millions of dollars. But for a new coinage or an exotic language or a double-barreled, two words stuck together, the prices of domain names have settled in a range, like, between $1,000 and $5,000. There's a huge number of warehouse names that are available. And so that's very valuable. Of course, not every product in the whole world needs its own exactmatch.com domain name. And so I tell people all the time that they need to pick the right name first, and then we'll build the domain name. And I have, in fact, I have mentors who are strong believers. One of them, Nancy Friedman, who's a strong believer that building the domain name is one more chance, one more opportunity to build and extend your brand. If Gunnion.com is taken, call Gunnion or ask Gunnion or Gunnion names or GunnionKnows.com. Obviously, adding that word to the brand word greatly increases your chances of availability. But also, she sees it and advises that it's a positive thing. And it's just another way for you to extend your brand, help define it, and even make it memorable what you do. So that's a couple of important things there. Not everything needs its exactmatch.com. Plus, as I'm sure you know, in the last 5 years especially, maybe because of the scarcity of so many names, that people, the audience, the consumer world has become more sophisticated to the fact that there might be something to the right of the dot other than .com, and there's a lot more acceptance of .io, for example, and .ai now, and .net and .org and so on, and with their shades of meaning. So the audience is more sophisticated, but also it's another thing I tell clients is that you don't want to choose your name just because you can get the exactmatch.com, because who knows 5 years from now. Like you said, they've been telling us for 20 years that the .com is fading and something else will take its place. But it could well happen very soon that 5 years from now, it may be that people do all their searching verbally with their computers, and just say, where is the Premiere Theater schedule for tonight, instead of, assuming it's premieretheater.com or premiere.com. So there's always that possibility. And so that's a reason not to hang your entire branding initiative on the availability of a .com. And so you can always tell when a company has named itself because the .com was available. When you see some mangled spelling or some terrible pun or just something, just an ugly word, it's because the .com was available. And that's how they got there. And that's I think in a consumer that makes you just trust the company a little bit, or think less of them if they made that compromise at the very beginning.
No, that's a good point. It's a compromise, and I very much agree with you on a few things there. One is that domainers, I think the whole domaining market is hugely misunderstood, and I kind of got to where you got to eventually, even before I started working in it, but more so when I started working in that space, is that the reality is if there weren't, and it's not just domain investors. Domain investors are part of it, but as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of individuals that register the name thinking they're going to do something with it and they didn't, or they had a company that failed, or product that never, whatever, or so many reasons that people get a domain name and they hold on to it because they have their reasons. In a way, I think it keeps those names for somebody who has proved their business idea, their brand, their, they see it's working, and now they can invest whatever that domain name costs, right, instead of, and it's still available, because otherwise it would be, And as you just mentioned, there are different levels now of domain names available depending on their desirability, I guess, is the common thing there, that are available to different levels of development of companies. And I completely agree with you. And that's what the advice that I give to people oftentimes, because I work with domain names that are like really sought after and valuable. And obviously a lot of time people can't afford those. My advice is to think about, a name that works for them, regardless of the domain name, see how it works. And then obviously if it works, eventually the price of that domain name is not going to be a problem. Or they can, as you said, add different words, and then as they grow into the brand, decide, how to go about it in the future. But
even Elon Musk, Tesla was found at teslamotors.com.
Tesla Motors, it was for 11 years or more, I think.
He finally had the budget where he could get Tesla.com. And so
Facebook is the same. Facebook was the Facebook. I mean, we have like a whole bunch of stories like that of smart branding, of companies that get their right domain name once they are established. And the reality is that those names are desirable. And that dictates the evaluation, very much like real estate. You don't open a business and go and get yourself, top spot on whatever.
Times Square. Right?
Exactly.
Sure, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
They are like addresses in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And it's not unusual to change addresses. And I think the consumers are hip to that and understand even when it needs to change, if it's making the brand sleeker and easier to communicate, that's not unusual, and people understand that.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, I do feel it communicates, like you said, when you're making, if I try to formulate it as an advice to our listeners, when you're making a choice that is a compromise. So obviously you can't get the exact brand match.com. You're going to go for a compromise. I loved your suggestions earlier with Gunnion, ask Gunnion, or Gunnion knows. You can make it fun. It does still communicate, okay, we couldn't get the com, but it does say, we're fun, we know what we're doing, we're on the right track, etc. And so one day if you upgrade, let's say, to Gunnion.com, people are going to be, I knew, that's cool. They're going to feel like, and there's some great examples of companies that do that they start with a fun added name that is, still good on its own without matching the domain name, and then they upgrade and they make people feel like part of that success in that process. And I love that. That's really cool.
Yeah. I was, what was I, maybe 35, I guess, by the time I started in the business. But even then, there were people who had been branding experts and really knew a lot more about the entire branding business than I did when I first got in. And so I was lucky and picked up a lot of knowledge from people who were at big companies doing it when I came in. It used to be, this is a flashback for you. In '96, the first company I worked for, called Metaphor Name Consultants. It was a full-on naming company that was benefiting from being close to Silicon Valley. In those days, the first day of a naming project, when we got our brief, there would be 10 of us sitting around a conference table in downtown San Francisco. and there'd be the lady from Metaphor, and there'd be a couple people from the end client, and then there would be 7 or 8 namers sitting there at the table. We would get the brief all at once. Sometimes we would do an exercise, covering a wall with Post-it notes and so on. But then we would all be sent home for a week. Then we would reconvene back at that table a week later with the clients and the agency and all the namers. And each of us would read through our entire printed out on paper list there were no laptops on the table except maybe the client sometimes. And we would have to bring physical copies for everybody there. We would pass them all out. We would actually read through them. I mean, it sounds like I'm talking about the 1800s or something, but that was just 1996. So that's how far the business has come. These days, I haven't left the house to go to a briefing in 15 years, probably. It's now 100% remote, and since the pandemic, of course, it's now Zoom calls. It's face to face. But I ran my company exclusively by email for a decade there, and now it's all Zoom calls. So who knows? You may be having my hologram of me on your desktop.
That might be next thing. Yeah. I think my favorite so far is the Zoom phase over the pandemic, where like you're talking to people and you all like know you have your smart like top. And then like under that you're like in your underwear or something. That's so funny. And it's happened to me actually. Oh dear. I just came back from the shop and it's the evening here, so I had to dress. But it's happened to me like when I'm doing my training, like I'm running and I come back if I have a call earlier, I'm like in my running shorts and everything, just change my top or whatever. I had one time a guest who I think he just forgot he was in his underwear, but he literally got up and walked around, and I'm like, oh my God, don't make a sound.
And I'm surprised that one of my 2 cats is not coming to visit. This happens to me a lot. We're in the middle of the conversation, a cat on my lap.
I know. I have a cat somewhere here. Actually, the cat I have a puppy as well, and he's the more trouble one. Oh my God, he ate, like just before the call, I had to wash him because he chewed a pen, multicolored pen. So they're like, there was like colors. And I'm like, oh my God, I need to wash that quickly. But I still wanted to take pictures of it because it's funny. It's just crazy.
That's a modern world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I try to have the podcast within 30 minutes because then we start talking about cats and dogs.
Segue, yeah.
I just know how it goes.
Well, thanks very much. This has been very interesting to talk to you.
Absolutely, it's been fun talking to you too. We're going to include all the links so that people can reach you if they need naming something. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Great. Well, thanks, Tatiana, and best of luck with your enterprise. You keep establishing that market out there, and the price is up. That'll keep us both in business.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Smart Branding Podcast. Feel free to visit smartbranding.com for more information and reach out if you have any suggestions, questions, ideas, or just want to learn more about how a good domain name strategy can help you build a strong and successful brand. See you next time.